What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review for Vampire the Masquerade Swansong. This is a narrative RPG set in the World of Darkness universe, and more specifically, the Vampire the Masquerade. This game was also an Epic Games Store exclusive, however you still can get it on consoles, etc. Before we actually jump into the title, I want to mention that, again, this is a narrative RPG, so I'm going to give this video a TLDR, because it is difficult to review a game like this without spoiling it in any way, simply because the game is the story, basically, as narrative RPGs tend to play a lot like a choose-your-own-adventure book. So, because of that, the TLDR is that while I did enjoy the story, it is frankly not worth the $50 asking price, which is very high for a narrative game, which doesn't even include the 2 DLCs that launched with it that I also think are a bit overpriced. But you take that stuff in combination with the fact that this is an Epic Games Store exclusive, and you've created a game that is very hard to recommend. So that said, my official recommendation, if you will, is get it on sale, preferably when it eventually comes to Steam, most likely, as is usually the case with these games. It will likely be available for a reduced price, because I think something around like $30 would have been a fair price for this game. So with the TLDR out of the way, let's actually jump into this a little bit. So this story centers around the Boston Court of the Camarilla, which is actually attacked during a very high-stakes, crucial negotiation with another faction. Or rather, the ending of those negotiations and an entering of a formal agreement. However, this agreement, or party celebrating it, was attacked, and you have to play as 3 different vampires while you try to sort out this mystery and unravel some things that have happened. Now, on one hand, I think the game does a pretty decent job of exploring Vampire the Masquerade common themes, etc. If you're unaware of a lot of the terms and how things work, they do provide an in-game codex for you to learn the things. However, I will say that the game does seem to expect a certain amount of pre-knowledge, so while there are a few different Vampire the Masquerade games that get you up to speed pretty quickly, this game certainly provides a means for you to learn, but in terms of its narrative, it does seem to expect you to have known some of this stuff already, which I think is fair at this point, to be honest. But as I mentioned, we'll be playing as one of 3 established vampires of different clans. We will play Galeb Bazari of the Ventru clan, Amem Lewis of the Toreador clan, and Laisha of the Malkavian clan. Now, each of these, I think, is a pretty solid representation of their clan, or what it's supposed to be, as each vampire clan that comprises the Camarilla, which are typically the ones that you'll actually play in any various game, all have benefits and curses that are affected by which clan they belong to. However, in what is unusual for a Vampire the Masquerade game, we play as vampires that have already established themselves. That is to say, I think the youngest one we play is like 80 years old. Galeb in particular is pushing 300, which is unusual. Typically when you play these games, you play a freshly minted, so to speak, vampire. Now, I think there are 2 things that are noteworthy about that. One, simply the fact that it's unusual. It's kind of cool to play a vampire that already has a certain amount of status and bearing to them. But the other half of that is that there are situations where you kind of feel like you're not an older vampire, simply because it wouldn't suit the narrative for you to be like super powerful like a vampire that old would be. So there are times you'll be having a conversation with like a ghoul, which is a human that has vampire blood in them, or something like that, which shouldn't really be a test of your abilities to overcome, but it's very possible for your 300-year-old vampire, for instance, to fail this interaction, and it just feels a little silly at times. However, I will say that there are times where you are better suited not using your powers. So just because you have vampire powers and skills at your ability, it doesn't necessarily mean that employing them is always the best option. Because while I think there are things that you can poke holes in with this game, which we'll get to, I will say that the choice and consequence is relatively on point, which is good for a narrative RPG. But I talked about vampire powers, and those are primarily broken down into skills and disciplines. So disciplines are your literal vampire powers. Each clan has 3 disciplines associated with them. Some of them overlap a little bit, but these are the things that will allow you to bend humans to your will, either through trickery or just sheer force of will. And as you play the game and make successful checks or figure things out, the game will award you experience, which at the beginning of a scene, which are the levels for this game basically, you'll be able to assign those experience points and level up your vampire. Skills, on the other hand, are essentially the same thing, but they allow you to access knowledge in conversations, argue with someone, persuade someone, And there's a lot of overlap in between what skills and disciplines can do, honestly, in terms of interactions, but there is a difference, as vampire powers in particular tend to cost you hunger, which is another aspect of this. While you're playing the game, you are playing a vampire, and managing your hunger is part of that. As you navigate these scenes, you will be required to either feed on people where necessary, or manage your powers in an appropriate way that you don't ever build up a bunch of hunger. Because the other thing vampires struggle with in this universe is their beast, which basically means their hunger for blood. And if that ever gets too high, it can cause you a lot of problems. To recap real quick, you'll be using 3 established vampires with their own various skills and disciplines that they will use to navigate the scenes presented to them during this story. Which basically means every scene you're in kind of plays out like a little investigation in a lot of the cases. There are a few missions towards the end that are a bit more focused, but most of them feel very investigatory in nature. And broadly speaking, I will say that the game did a good job of exploring concepts you don't see really mentioned much in other games. Without straight up spoiling too much, it's hard to really elaborate on what those themes are, but I will say there are a lot of things that, frankly, because Bloodlines is the last genuine RPG that Vampire the Masquerade has seen, and everything since has basically been narrative RPGs. Because of that, there are a lot of concepts that are more recent in the 5th edition of Vampire the Masquerade, actually, that you don't see presented in a lot of other games. Outside of the other popular narrative RPG for Vampire the Masquerade, which is Coteries of New York and its standalone expansion, Shadows of New York. Now, without just flat out spoiling the rest of the title, there's really not much more I can explain to people. So, with that said, let's talk positives and negatives about what this game actually does well, and does not do so well. So, positives for me were that the story is pretty good. There's a lot of branching options. There are a lot of choices about what you find out or what you don't find out, the situations you get these vampires into. There are what I would consider a few major endings, and then there's some nuance. All of your 3 vampires can absolutely die, so you could get a bad ending where everyone's dead, basically. And once you've actually finished the game, which will typically run you about 10 to 15 hours for most people, I would say, you can then actually replay individual scenes and see how things would have played out differently, which is a nice way to pretty quickly see the other options, which I always appreciate in a narrative RPG especially. On the negative side of things, I think the obvious one is the animations. Truth be told, I would be hard-pressed to tell you what exactly the problem is, but some of these faces especially just look very off in a way that just really hits that uncanny valley very hard, which honestly makes the game feel a bit older than it is. And then the other negative that I would give this game is that, unfortunately, it has more or less the same plot of every Vampire the Masquerade game at this point. So if you're unaware, ever since Bloodlines, we have basically only seen narrative RPGs from Vampire the Masquerade. And while a lot of times the settings will change, the factions will change, the names will change, the core of the story stays basically the same. To the point where it kind of feels like when they're writing these RPGs, they might have like some sort of checklist that they're like, oh, we gotta have this thing, gotta have this thing. Now, I do think a lot of that is down to the fact that all of these narrative RPGs especially are made by different companies, and outside of a few individual elements, it just feels like a lot of their games are like, oh, here's an introduction to what Vampire the Masquerade is supposed to be, and here is it given in the story fashion for the Chronicle, which is what they call the tabletop games of Vampire the Masquerade. Because if you're unaware, the tabletop version of Vampire the Masquerade is very story-oriented, whereas other tabletop RPGs like Pathfinder or Dungeons & Dragons, etc. tend to be very mechanics-focused, and there's an opportunity for a lot of combat if that's your thing. Vampire the Masquerade is really much more about the story these days, and letting you roleplay within that story. And honestly, just given the fact that some of the vampire powers are a little hard to quantify, so to speak, there's a decent enough reason for that. But as a result, and the point of this rambling, is that it kind of feels like all of these narrative RPGs are basically trying to copy that, and it's almost like they're afraid to make a true RPG like, say, the original Bloodlines was. And because of that, again, I feel like the story of each of these games is starting to feel a little cookie cutter to me personally. Because while there are a few individual elements of each game recently that are different, I feel like I could compare this game to Coteries of New York, or honestly even Bloodlines, and point out almost identical plot elements, which is getting a little strange to me. But all of that rambling out of the way, let's actually draw a conclusion here. which is basically what I told you at the start of the video for the TLDR. This isn't a bad game. It's a narrative RPG, it's got a branching story, it's set in Vampire the Masquerade, it explores a few concepts that I really haven't seen touched on as much, but ultimately, I don't think this game does anything different from any other Vampire the Masquerade game. Because of the very disconnected narrative where you're constantly switching characters, it's hard to feel overly attached to any of them. And overall, it just feels like every Vampire the Masquerade game I've ever played in terms of what the story actually is. But nonetheless, it is a good story and it does do it well. So as such, if you ever see this on sale, or especially when it comes to Steam, probably on sale for like $20, $30, then I would go ahead and say pick it up if you got a free weekend and you want to see what it's all about. But beyond that, you could probably read a plot summary on like Wikipedia or whatever and be just as well off. So there you guys go. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please remember to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.